my privilege to welcome you today. And it's good to see Fritz and Peter, scary that is, and Wolfgang Pordzik, and others, too many to greet by name. Do me a favor, if you would, just at the top, if you're in a position to do so, switch your camera on so that we can see you just for a moment, just to say hi, if you don't mind. Thank you all. That's very nice. And then, obviously, if you need to multitask and it's more convenient to you for any reason to have your camera turned off during this session, obviously feel free to do so. So again, I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose, and we have as guest of honor today, Mathilde Fasting from Norway. She joins us from a summer cottage, not in Oslo. She may tell us more about that. But to the matter at hand, Mathilde is an economist. She is a historian of ideas. She writes about political and economic history of Norway. She is a knowledgeable and interesting observer of politics in the region and in Scandinavia and elsewhere. So first things first, Mathilde, welcome, and thank you for making time for us.
You're welcome. I'm really pleased to be here and to do this event. It's really nice for you that you invited me to do it.
So thank you. Well, I want to talk a little bit. We're going to do this as we do these things. I'm going to interview, if you will, Mathilde for the first 20 to 30 minutes. And then we're going to open it up to the gallery for questions and comments. It's my own view that we Americans, anyway, can always stand to listen and learn more about the world outside of ourselves. And then as far as Europe is concerned, it seems to me that we know lots in general about Scandinavia, but not nearly enough specifically about Norway and neighboring countries. This is a great opportunity. But let me start here, and I'll tell you how we're going to end up with end of lockdown, state of liberalism, and relations with the United States. We're going to start, Mathilde, with your new book. You were the editor and curator of a book called After the End of History, published now or published last month by, I believe it's Georgetown University Press. And it's a series of conversations with Francis Fukuyama, our co-founder, chairman of our editorial board. Can we start there? And I apologize to all of you. It's good manners to hold the book up. I have the Kindle version on my iPad, and that's the way I've enjoyed it. But do look it up, order it, read it, get it from Amazon. Mathilde, After the End of History, Conversations with Francis Fukuyama. First things first, why this book and why now? How did you come onto this? How did you conceive it?
It's actually a long story. So it started out, I would say, when I first read his book, not the End of History book, but the Political Order books. And they were from 2011, 2014, about that time. And I got curious because I kind of got aware of how my own country fitted into his picture of political order, and also the next book, the Political Decay book, and everything that can go wrong, and obviously goes wrong all the time. And from there, I really became interested in what he had been doing all along. And I met him, or I heard him in a lecture in Oslo. He was there because he has Norwegian friends. And then the next time he came, that was a little by coincidence, but he came to Oslo in 2018, and then I was lucky enough to join a small lecture that he held, a small, quite private lecture, and then joining him for dinner afterwards. We started talking, and ever since I've been talking to him each time I had questions to pose to him, and we have been doing these series of interviews over a couple of years. And of course, what was interesting to me then was that I read After the End of History, and then his new book, Identity, came, and I kind of got a picture of his whole kind of development, I would say, because many things has happened since 1989 and 1992 when the book came, his first book. And then he had written about trust, he'd written about capitalism, he'd written about lots of things that I really found interesting. And finally, I ended up by reading everything that he had published and a lot of articles and everything. So that gave me a picture of a man who really has this broad, very interesting background and also lots of interesting things to say. And that's how I came up with the idea to do this conversation book, to give everyone a picture of his development and his thoughts that are so relevant and interesting in so many different fields. And then it's also the book that I will probably going to talk about, the Norwegian book. I have my co-author here in the audience, and that is also originally an attempt to explain Fukuyama's thoughts about political order, because Norway he's not saying getting to Norway, he's saying getting to Denmark, and Denmark is another Scandinavian country. But I wanted to show that his thoughts could be applied to our society as well. And we also have challenges, but many of those pillars that he is talking about is really relevant to us. And we are kind of has been up so far a kind of a model for that. So he agreed to talk to me, and ever since we have been talking.
Thank you. And then the conversations, the interviews, did you conduct these by Zoom, by telephone? Were some of them in person? Were they by email? Just a question to the method. How did you do this?
I started out by preparing a really long guide. I think it was almost half a book already. It was like 50 pages. And I went to Stanford, I met him in person, and we talked for about altogether 2 days. So the first round of interviews were personal and face-to-face, and I recorded everything, and it was a huge job to just try to sort it out afterwards. And then the second time he came to Norway just before the COVID-19 kind of attacked us all actually it was in February last year, and we continued talking. So I got lots of new perspectives, also all the things that had happened. And then finally, for the last rounds of details and corrections and things, we have, of course, been communicating by emails and so forth. And I remember one thing that was really hard was that, as I said, the last interviews were in February 2020. And when COVID came, we knew that is going to be, it will be a big change. I'm not sure if it's going to be 1989 moment, but it's going to be a year that we will remember. And just both because of the pandemic, and also because another thing that was really important to Frank, as he's called, was that the elections in your country, the election came up in November. So I said to him, we have to have the final comments on that, because that is really crucial for how the developments are going to be in the world. So so it was a hard finishing line, but I hope we managed.
So thank you. Let's move into the substance of what you talked about in this series of interviews or conversations. You knew him, you certainly were acquainted with the work at hand. Were there any surprises?
I think that to many people, it might have been surprising. To me, I think that the long red line, I would say, that you can draw from his after his end of history book, and especially the last part of that title, which the last man is the last part of that title, and also all the things that he really is writing about. It's not only economics and politics, it's a lot of sociology, psychology and things in there. I think that was really both intriguing and very interesting how he applies that. And I think also that he gradually has come to the conclusion that these things are really important. It also comes up when he talks about institutions. And but it's fair to say that I wasn't surprised because I'd read all his works. So if he had surprised me, really surprised me, I wouldn't have gone into his works before the interviews. But to many readers, I think those things might have been a little surprising.
So you mentioned, Mathilde, institutions, and you devote a chapter to, and I think the chapter is called How We Build Liberal Democratic Societies. And of course, we're all interested in learning more about how liberal democratic societies are built and preserved and defended in times like these. Can you tell us a little bit about that part of the conversation?
Yeah, one thing is the historical thing about that, because if you use Norway as a model, you have we have been doing that for 200 years or so, and that is one thing. And I think that you could say that those most successful countries, they have had what he calls the rule of law. You've had a system for that. And then you've had a state capacity bureaucracy building period, and then finally you have democracy. And I know that he had been talking and discussing those things with his mentor and his teacher, Samuel Huntington, and I also talked to him a lot about those conversations. But we know, and he says that after he has been working a lot with developing countries, he has seen that this is not so easy now, because you don't have 200 years to do it. And if you are in a poor condition, a country is really don't have institutions, they don't have rule of law, they might not have democracy. How do you go about to do that? Can you fix that? And how important is it that you do all these three things? Because what he says and what I believe is that if you don't have those three pillars in any kind of form, you will probably not succeed. And that's interesting, and it's hard, but the other way around, to see it positively, and I think also Frank will do that, is that if you know a little bit about what the recipe is, or what works and what doesn't work, then you might use that as a model to build something quicker than using 200 years or so. So that's why I guess he's going, he told me he's going a lot to Ukraine, for instance. He's going to places where this is important, and he's teaching them about these very important things to build democracies, and sound democracies that have chances to survive and to sustain different things in the world, as we see if you're looking at now indexes for authoritarian regimes and things. It's not going the right way all the time. So you need to be resilient. And how do you do that?
So that leads somewhat naturally to my next question. Can we talk a little bit about Europe and the United States? And you do have a section that addresses the difference in traditions, or liberal traditions, or traditions of liberalism. Can you tell us a little bit about that and that part of your conversation?
Yes, I'm always, and I'm still curious about that word, because liberal and liberalism is for a European and for a Norwegian, I would say that my conception of that would be what you might call classical liberalism, thinking about the European history of ideas and classical thought about liberal and being liberal. And I think that when you go to the United States, you don't have the same system in a way. You don't have socialism like we have. You don't have it's a very different system. So sometimes I see that that the term neoliberalism is used, and I'm also wondering what is that, and how could you say that liberalism means no state? How could you say that or a small state, those things? And to a Norwegian and to a European, I think we are much more used to thinking about, maybe a little in Norway, also a German tradition, that you're not afraid of the state. You think that is part of a liberal system, and even though that might seem strange to a liberal in the United States. So I still can't really tell you. I just see that after talking about these things with Fukuyama and also reading books about that, I have had a very good conversation with Helena Rosenblatt, who wrote a story or a book, came out in the US about 2 years ago, called The Lost History of Liberalism. And I got a lot of insights from her, tracing liberalism from antiquity and upwards. And it has so many meanings, that word. It's really very hard to pinpoint what is exactly liberalism. Maybe to a Norwegian it has to do with freedom, it has to do with the freedom of choice, it has to do with being a diverse society, and you can find that also in socialism to some point. So to us, US debates might seem very strange at sometimes it does, because I think the grounding for the political order is very different.
Mm-hmm. It does seem to me that liberalism, broadly defined, as you said, definitions can vary, is being challenged today in different countries in different ways, and from different sources, different ways and different sources. You have a section on identity politics. Tell us a little bit about that part of your conversation with Frank Fukuyama. And if you would, most of us on this call are acquainted with the debate about identity politics in the United States. Some of us are somewhat acquainted with how this now manifests itself in places like Germany and in France, but certainly less so in my case about Norway and whether this is a topic and what it looks like. Could you dig into that, Mathilde?
A little, yeah. I think that the issue is much more. It's much more up in the debates in those countries that you mentioned, and especially, of course, in the United States. And it has to do with polarization. It has to do with a lot of things. But I think that when you have a society like you have with many different people living together in one society, coming from different traditions, different countries originally, and so forth, you kind of get, it's harder to keep them seeing, as you have done in the US so far, but not now, that you have a common ground, so to say. And for Norwegians, I think that idea of being American and have this common ground, it has been something that we have been cheering, and we are thinking that this is really good. But now we are seeing a different America where you have many different fractions, and you call it identity politics, and it seems harsher and harsher, and you have those debates, and they come on to Norway, and they come on to Norwegian press, Norwegian media, and we discuss them here. But if you are looking at our society, we don't find the same kind of polarization here in Norway. And sometimes it gets, the debates are kind of, if I should say so, constructed in a way to try to make things look like they are in the US, which they are obviously are not. So and it has to do with the origins of the society. Norwegians up until very recently, we have been one people in a way. Norwegians ethnically, it's us in this country, and we have had for the past 30 to 40 years people coming in, immigrants. And I might just also, because my co-author of this Norwegian book, he might just say something about that, because as you would probably know, we had this horrendous thing that happened it's actually 10 years to this year. In about a month, we are not celebrating because that's not the correct term to use, but it's the 22nd of July. And my co-author here, he knows a lot about that, so he might be just joining us for the conversation and answer a little bit more about identity politics and those things. So Oystein, if you are here, you could just maybe
let's. I do see him, and let's hold just for 1 second. I have one mechanical thing. I'm the last person to say this because I'm so inelegant and unprofessional about Zoom. But Mathilde, at least on my iPad, I see the bottom half of your face and not the top half of your face. Is that the same with others, or is that just me?
She's coming through fine on my screen.
Okay, then there we go. So then I apologize. Thank you, Fritz. So let me ask a couple questions then about Norway. And let's invite you, Mathilde, to introduce your colleague. And then I'll ask a couple questions to the two of you. That will bring us to about half past the hour, and then we'll open it up to our colleagues. Mathilde, would you like to do the honors of properly introducing your colleague?
Absolutely. I have been working and talking to Oystein Sorensen many times during the past 10, 15 years. And I introduced him to this Norwegian book project that we have called the Norwegian Exception, with a question mark behind it. And when I finally found out, I had the manuscript, but I found out this is so in the middle of what Oystein is doing. He's a professor at the University of Oslo, and he's really knowledgeable. So he, to my great pleasure, he said yes to come and join me for the manuscript. So we have been working on this book for about now, I think, 2 years, and I've also, if you want, later maybe in the discussions, before I let Oystein just have word here, I have some quite interesting COVID statistics that shows that Scandinavia is just not Scandinavia all the time, especially not during this pandemic, and especially if you compare Norway to Sweden. So if you're interested later on, I can do a little math on that.
So thank you, and I'm sure we are. And to both of you and Oystein, could we talk a little bit about, you just mentioned it, July 22nd and a 10-year anniversary. Can you take us back to what happened? We will remember, but you will tell us much more, and then get us a little bit into contemporary Norwegian politics, challenges, questions of social cohesion, and so forth. But please go ahead.
Hello. First, I seem to have some technical problems here. I got messages now and then that the internet connection is unstable. So you have to excuse me if I...
So if Oystein gets out, he has been really going into the name of this person, is Anders Behring Breivik. And we have also, yeah, there you are, Oystein.
Yeah. You see, the picture seems to freeze now and then. So I'm not sure I will be able to continue in, but I'll try.
Thank you. Right now it's good.
Okay, well, yes. This Norwegian terrorist, Anders Behring Breivik, of course, his terrorist act 10 years ago. He tried to blow up the central government building in Oslo. And then he drove out and boarded a boat over to a small island where the youth organization of the Norwegian Social Democratic Party had a summer camp. And then he started his mass shooting. And he was able to kill, I think he killed 77 people, a few of them in the government building, and most of them at this Utøya island. This, of course, was a horrific terrorist act. And he is, let me say this very clearly, you can't count him as a normal participant in the Norwegian political culture. He's way outside of everything. Even his supposed allies and friends were horrified by this terrorist act. But he had a very interesting, in some ways, ideological reasoning behind his terrorist act. Of course, when he tried to blow up the government building, that was mainly symbolic to strike at the heart of the Norwegian regime, the Norwegian political elite. And then when he massacred those 16, 17, 18-year-olds at this summer camp, the reasoning was that, well, they are the socialist youth now, but in 10 years they will be ministers and chief bureaucrats and so on in the Norwegian state. So this terrorist act was meant to stop that by just killing them. His position then was sort of counter-jihadist or counter-Muslim. He was against the Muslim invasion of Norway as he perceived it, and he was against the political elite in Norway who, well, let all those Muslim immigrants come here and take over the country. He, well, has obviously a very warped mind, but he was considered sane by the Norwegian court and sentenced. And in prison, he has continued to write political, ideological tracts. And nowadays, he seemed to have converted into some sort of hardcore neo-Nazism ideology. He wasn't neo-Nazi then 10 years ago. But this,
Yes.
of course, had very strong repercussions in the Norwegian society, and we still feel it. We are not used to that kind of terrorism or that kind of political violence in Norway. Let me just finish by adding one thing. I think one very important aspect of Norwegian political culture is its peacefulness. We are used to compromises, to deliberations, and to peaceful solutions, and not to political violence.
Yeah, if I could just add, Oystein,
Sure.
it's just those things that you are saying. If I should say two things that would characterize Norwegian society and politics in general, it's just exactly that. It's the art of compromise, which also comes from another thing that's really important that we might dig into as well. It's trust. So the high levels of trust and the ability, even if people are disagreeing, they are willing to do compromises. And the other thing that's really has been very a thing that's been happening all the time through these 200 years since we became a nation. It has been people are sticking to it, even if they would disagree beforehand. They kind of respect the others when it's all settled.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So as I've been listening, my list of questions grows. However, it's now 1/2 and it's exactly the right time when we want to open the conversation up to colleagues. So if you would press that button that shows a raised hand, or simply raise your hand in the screen, I would be happy to call on you. And I'm scanning right now. Anybody want to jump in to be first? While you were thinking, then I'll ask one from my list. This question of social capital and levels of trust, so central to the healthy functioning of democracies. Could you both tell us a little bit about how Norway compares to other Scandinavian countries and how the populist phenomenon varies from country to country in this part of Northern Europe?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I can start, Oystein, and you could just fill in, because I think that generally in Scandinavia, the levels are high. In all surveys that you see, you find that the general level of trust is high in all those three countries. If you include Denmark and Sweden and Norway, it's more or less the same thing. But there are other things that make us different. And when it comes to populism, and when it comes to, like Oystein just touched on here, the origins of Anders Behring Breivik before he became a terrorist. We have populist parties also in our three countries, but they have very different origins, and it's also a fact that Sweden, for instance, they have been accepting a lot more immigrants from Muslim countries and from countries outside Europe in general than the two other countries have. And if you look at the statistics for the lockdown, for the deaths, and how they have handled the COVID pandemic, the picture is really different. So Sweden is then an outlier compared to Denmark and Norway. That hasn't to do with populism, but it has to do with trust, and it has to do with how they have treated Sweden, the COVID pandemic, much more with one person on top, and he being the specialist. And with Norway, in Norway's case, we have been cooperating again, finding politicians, head of institutes of health and so forth. They have been cooperating and making solutions out of that, and that made the society trust in the things that came, the lockdowns, the different rules and so forth. Whereas in Sweden, they started out by not doing any lockdowns. And I think they were even surprised on what happened, because compared to deaths, we haven't passed 800 deaths yet. We have 785 last time I saw. And in Sweden, they have 14,000, and they are the double. They have a double population than we have. We are about 5 million. They are about the double. So the tolls are much higher. So I just want to start with that, and saying that there are actually quite big differences when you dig into details. What about you, Oystein? You might say something about the political parties, populism.
Yeah, well, to an outsider, to an American, for instance, I believe the similarities would appear very, very strong. And in some ways, of course, the three countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, well, they are very similar. But historically, well, Denmark and Sweden, they are traditional enemies. Norway and Denmark was one single state for 400 years until early 19th century. There were wars year out and year in between Sweden on the one side and Denmark, Norway on the other side. But in more recent times, the last 200 years, there has been peace in Scandinavia between the Nordic countries anyway. So I don't think this history of rivalry and war is that important now, except for I think this history has well, it's a pointer to different strands of nationalism and populism in these countries. For instance, Sweden, as an old belligerent country with militarist history, a very strong state in the 17th, 18th century. Well, Swedish nationalism has always been very conservative, right-wing, while Norwegian nationalism has been left-wing, left populist, so to say. And recently, the populist parties in Norway and Sweden, well, they have some common ground, of course, but historically they are very different. The Swedish main right-wing populist party, well, it was originally extreme right-wing, nearly neo-Nazi political group, which reformed itself and grew into the present party. The Norwegian leading populist party, on the other hand, well, it stems from liberalist opposition to the strong social democratic state, and still is very, well, officially anyway, marked by liberalism, classic liberalism, that's to say.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I'm going to continue, but anybody in the gallery at this stage want to jump in? I'm looking, I don't want to neglect anybody. Okay, if I, oh, Michelle, please.
Fritz has his hand up.
Forgive me, Fritz and then Wolfgang Pordzik. Fritz.
All right, you really took my first question, which was the COVID. I'm fascinated by it because there has been in the US, obviously there's a very strong anti-vax movement, and for quite some time, they would point to Sweden, and unfortunately, they would sort of say, all too often they'd say Scandinavia, without making a distinction, which was very frustrating when you'd say, well, it was just Sweden. Now you've answered that, and that was fascinating. Thank you. Can I take it sort of the next step? And that is, I'm curious, is there a strong anti-vaccination movement in Norway at all? And
no.
Okay. And then, well, let me, you know what?
No, but
if this is too simple, I have a little tougher one that's similar. And that is, if you don't have that,
really. So sorry. There is indeed an anti-vaccine movement in Norway too, and well, they have their demonstrations and so on. But compared to most other countries in Europe, for instance, Germany, it's very little significant. Just a few hundred people demonstrating in the streets regularly in Oslo, and not a mass movement or anything like that at all.
I meant to check the Hopkins statistics before the chat today, and I forgot. But last time I looked, Norway was doing very well on vaccinations. It looked like. How do you have a rough idea what percent at this point?
Yes, I looked it up, and more than 95% so far have said yes to vaccines. It's really to the COVID pandemic, and by mid-July, in about 4 weeks' time, all over 18 years will have had the first dose of. We are not only using the two mRNA, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, not the AstraZeneca, and I think that's. I think that when that came, those blood cloth things about the AstraZeneca thing, Norway was struck quite hard compared to the population. So we had quite a few cases here. Right. And that's probably due to another thing that is a very strength of what we are. This title of this seminar is the state capacity, which also comes to statistics and comes to how we are reporting things, because some say that we have so many good data and statistics about people, and people are willing to give that because we trust the state to use it in a good way. So that's how we very quickly come up with getting these symptoms. They register, they put it into and it's all also that has now developed into many sophisticated and good systems in many areas that now is digital instead of being just put on paper. So those things, I think it's easier in a society where you have state capacity and where you have trust in the state and in bureaucracy in using things that being secure. So that's another kind of extra information about just the COVID thing. That's much wider, of course. It comes into other things as well.
See, and that part of the wider thing is what intrigues me, and that is disinformation, because in the US we have a huge issue with it. In Germany, we have a huge issue, and so on. Disinformation is a constant battle, interferes in elections, et cetera, et cetera. You well know that. Is Norway besieged as much by disinformation as many of its NATO allies?
I wouldn't say so. Would you, Oystein? I would say that because, of course, freedom of speech, functioning media, journalism, we have a state channel, the NRK, same as BBC. We were, up until recently, the most newspaper reading people in the world. So people have we have lots of newspapers, different newspapers compared to the size of, and they are, of course, also digital now, but you have lots of information, and usually it's quite transparent. And I have just heard people talking about how they really go in and monitor places that might be fabricating fake news and things, and they usually get up to the surface, and we are trying as best as we can. So I would say that it's quite transparent. So seeing difference or seeing big scandals here in Norway, or news in Norway that's really turned out to be fake news, I can't think of anything right now that has been the case so far. It doesn't seem that we are immune to this, because everyone, we're not immune. But for the time being, it seems that we have a functioning society that takes care of these things as they should do in a functioning liberal democracy.
Very good.
Thank you, and thank you, Fritz. Wolfgang, can we turn to you now?
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Mathilde. If I may, I would like to come back to your book, which I find intriguing. Can you tell us how the reaction has been so far? I have come across over the last decade plus, across so many politicians, analysts, starting their presentation with the thesis, well, obviously the prediction, the end of history has been reached, as wrong. And then going on to ridicule Fukuyama. Most of those never read the book and totally misunderstood the author, I'm sure. But I just wonder, how has been the reaction? Did people ask, how come you now take this scholar who almost 2 decades ago came up with a wrong perspective as to mankind's future? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. So far, I haven't heard anybody criticizing the book in the way that you might think they would have. On the contrary, I think that the people reading the interviews with Frank Fukuyama now, they are seeing this more as I think it should be seen, that this idea of liberal democracy, what the original thought. And as you said, many didn't read his book and so forth, so they based it on. And it's really, interesting, or really, very easy to be taking that phrase and just using it for anything you don't like, and just say how come you have so many dictators in the world, how come, and so forth. So I think that I wouldn't say it's easier to read just these interviews. And then my aim has been, if you do that, maybe you would be interested in reading more about either Fukuyama's books or other things that might interest you, to see if this is to get a broader understanding of these different questions. So I hope that people will do that, and I hope they will stop ridiculing an idea of liberal democracy as such, because what he's saying is that is probably the best thing that we have ever tried to or have ever come up with as a political system. It doesn't say that we won't have a lot of different others in the world, and China, of course, as he is also saying himself, is a contester in this picture. It's not a liberal democracy, but it's working so far. And he says that maybe, and I think that's a good thing, because when a human or when a person like Frank can reflect on the things that he said 20, 30 years ago and be able to put in nuances, admitting that he was not wrong, but he has found more information, changing his views in a way, and making them clearer and so forth. I like that, because I think one of the most dangerous things is that if people make up their mind and they are never willing to change their arguments, even though facts might tell you that it's not the case, even though it seems like you cannot say that the things that you believe in as a 20-year-old will never change. Maybe some ground values will be there, but if you're not open, like he is, for new ideas and for new information and for making your argument and even admitting that you were wrong at some point, I think that's a very good quality. And that's also some personal things that I wanted to convey with these interviews.
Thank you, and thank you, Wolfgang. Could you tell us a little bit, democracy virtually everywhere is facing stress tests, and certainly here in the United States. Could you tell us a little bit about how Norwegian media, Norwegian public and political debate is seeing America right now, the transition from Donald Trump to Joe Biden? President Biden proclaims we're back. What does that mean? Does that resonate? Is there skepticism, amusement? How are people talking about, discussing, and analyzing political affairs in the United States today?
Oh, I think, of course, that Norwegians, we were like you, horrified, many of you, horrified when Trump won. And I think the news, just like in the US, they've been full of Donald Trump, also in Norway for 4 years. And generally, I would say that it's quite rare to find, maybe I know some people that might say that Trump was good and so forth, and they would have, but they are again a minority. Most people will say that was really bad. They would also say that being concerned about the relationship, the US, Norway, or US, NATO, US, whatever, US, Europe, and really being horrified each time he went on stage and went to either Europe, to Russia, to Korea, wherever. And then when Biden won, it's the same as all the people in the US that wanted Biden to win. We were believed in a very profound way. And right now we have Biden visiting Europe, and we are following that closely. But then we have commentators also saying that the relationship between Europe and the United States will kind of never be exactly the same as it was before. So the thing is that we have to bring Norwegians we have to be a little bit realistic here, because China is coming up as a big player, and even during this presidency of Trump, China has kind of developed even more. So I think it's going to be hard, and I think it's both the institutions that Norway, as a small country, we are absolutely dependent on having international institutions that works. Otherwise, we are just a small country. You can't compare it to a smaller state in the United States. We are about 5 million people. So I think that these 4 years with Trump and also with China, they have made us a bit less naive, and getting us a little bit more had a reality check in a way. But I won't say that we don't still love America, because many people do. So I think that hasn't changed, and it has, as I said, Biden is giving us hope, but maybe a more realistic hope than Obama did when he came in. It's more realism right now. I'm not sure if you want to say something, Oystein, but I think that's the picture.
I take that as nothing to add at this moment. Michelle, my colleague, Michelle High, who's managing editor of American Purpose. Michelle.
Yes, again, thank you so much. And so enjoyable to listen to both of you. So just, you know, when Americans think of Scandinavian countries, Norway, et cetera, there's often, you know, we're tinkering and looking at policies, and I think we're more open-minded to certain types of policies that before we would have said, oh, the Europeans do it that way, we don't do it that way. But just, you know, in terms of the themes of what you've been discussing and COVID and legitimacy and populism, do you look toward us and think, you know, because we're so different and we often think things that work there can't work here because you're so small and the society is so much more homogenous. And so the question is just, are there things that you look at the way things are there that you think could work here and should work here? And if we only paid more attention to you, we would be doing things better in some ways?
That's a hard question. I think personally, I would say that that's a couple of years ago, I would probably look to the US for entrepreneurship, for instance, for being for having a vibrant capitalist society. But I think at some point the compass is kind of turning back again towards Norway and saying that maybe things they have developed not in the good direction in the US. So I think that people in Norway, and that's a shame for many, well, it's not, I can't say, but if you're looking at inequality, if you're looking at other things that are important, you don't look to the US. Like you might have done before, social mobility, for instance. So I think the US, you have a harder way upwards again to be the idol of not only Norwegians but other European countries as well when it comes to many of those traditional things that we were thinking about before. When it comes to what you could learn, we still think that having healthcare like we have, like having good when you're having children, kindergartens, all those things that we do, that we find when women, for instance, are working and they get time off with their child and so forth, the fathers do as well. Those things that we find natural, there might be some things that you might want to look at, and but also again, what Fukuyama and his books and also this work about Norway has taught me is that you can't really compare societies really easily because it has so much to do with history, with people living there, with their traditions, with institutions and so forth. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn something from each other. It's important to do that. I also remember I asked Frank about that, and he said that, do you believe that a culture is always, a culture in a wide sense is static? Do you believe that people are never kind of influenced by others? And I said, no, of course not. People are all the time. So, and that was also his main point in the discussions about Huntington, I remember, because he said, my view of those interactions is much more dynamic and open than his views were. So, again, back to what can be learned, maybe you should be more curious. That's, I think, being curious and open is two very, very important things in liberal democracies. If you stop being curious, if you stop being open, if you're going back to protectionism, if you're think that you could solve all your problems by yourself, then you are on the wrong track. And I think very easily going in directions that I don't think is viable and not good for the people living in countries like that. Look at Hungary, for instance. Quite close to us, and even Poland, even closer.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I think as I see the time racing, and I hear those words, Mathilde, because those are words that we try to live by. American Purpose is new, but it has a character and culture, and we strongly believe in staying curious and open and learning. And you and your colleague, Mr. Sorensen, have helped us a lot today in a very rich, informative, and stimulating conversation. Before I thank you, a word of advertisement, if I may. Of course, all of you keep, if you would, reading American Purpose. We have a very good article tomorrow by Dan Schroe, University of Washington, Seattle, on alliances and allies. Tomorrow and Thursday, we'll be discussing on Zoom the Biden-Putin summit tomorrow in Geneva. Tomorrow, we're with Tom Tugendhat of the UK Parliament and former President of Estonia, Tom Ilves, and on Thursday with John Bolton, former National Security Advisor. On Friday this week, we return to these subjects of challenge and crisis, if you will, of liberalism with George Packer. He has a new book, George Packer of the New Yorker and the Atlantic. Thank you for indulging me. But really, thank you all for taking valuable time, for contributing. Mr. Sorensen, nice to meet you this way. Mathilde, nice to see you. And Mathilde, we commend your book, After the End of History. Please, you all, buy it, read it, Georgetown University Press. Mathilde, you as guest of honor, you have the final word or last observations.
So nice being here and talking about this. And I think that in order to get just a brief view of the last 30 years and what's to come, it's a good place to start with the conversation with Frank. It's just not because I have written them or been interviewing him, but I think there's so many things in that book that really is interesting for the thought and also interesting to develop on different other. If you're interested in one thing, you could start there and then you could just go on reading. And then again, openness and curiousness, and there's no such thing as too many books and no such things as a good internet page as the American Purpose. So I recommend that as well. Really good.
So thank you, Mr. Sorensen. Thank you, Mathilde. Please come see us sometime soon in Washington, D.C. We'd like to experience your company live. Same with all of you. So it is now 12:59 Eastern. We're going to adjourn. Thank you all very much. Great conversation. Deeply appreciative.
Tusen tack.
Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.